All right, folks. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. All right. So thank you so much for coming today. We're really excited to have you guys here. Welcome to the Cape Cod Maritime Museum's Winter 2023 Lecture Series. I'm Elizabeth York, the museum's executive director. We've got a little bit of a change up today. If you're a regular at our lectures, you're probably used to seeing Mary Everett Patrick-Wynn as the host. I'm usually behind the scenes, making sure that the lecture is running smoothly. However, I'm going to be playing both roles today. Today's lecture is sponsored by the Mid-Cape Cultural Council and the Mass Cultural Council, as well as our 2023 corporate sponsors, Cape Air and Highline Cruises. A big thank you to them for their generous support of the museum. Now, at the risk of sounding like PBS, it's worth noting that programs like this lecture today are made possible by the support from folks like yourselves watching here today. I urge you to consider donating or becoming a member. Your support really helps us host programs like these and many others. So please consider donating today and keep our programs running. Before we get started, just a few reminders about our Zoom lecture format. Please be sure to keep your microphone and videos off and muted so that all of the attention can be on our speaker today. This also helps keep the sound and video quality for the speaker at the highest quality possible being delivered to you. If you have any technical issues, my first recommendation is always to leave the lecture, restart your Zoom, and then come back in. If you have any further issues, please send me a message via the chat function, and we can try to figure that out together. Also, if you have a question for today's speaker, you can type that into the chat or the Q&A. Our speaker will be taking questions at the end, but you can type your question in at any point during the talk. So today I'm very happy to welcome Ken Kostel, the Director of Research Communication at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Over the past 12 years, Ken has sailed on more than a dozen research expeditions, 5 with the research submersible Alvin, which we're going to be speaking about today. In 2021, during the sub's sea trials after its recent upgrade, Ken made his first dive in Alvin to a then recorded depth of 5,338 meters, which is 3.3 miles. So cool, in the Puerto Rico Trench. And when he's not at sea, which is most of the time, Ken helps scientists, engineers, and technicians communicate their work to the public and then to policymakers in order to improve appreciation for and protection of the things that the ocean does for everyone every day. Ken, we're so happy to have you with us today, and we're really looking forward to hearing all about your experiences on Alvin.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thanks everyone for coming, and thank you to the Cape Cod Maritime Museum for having me. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully, okay, Elizabeth, do you see the presenter or the audience view?
Presenter view.
Presenter. So now I got to switch it again. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. Thanks again, and good afternoon, everybody. Again, as Elizabeth said, my name is Ken Kostel. I'm the Director of Research Communications at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which we call WHOI, and you will hear me say that several times. So just in full disclosure, as my job title indicates, I don't work for the Alvin group at WHOI. But I have been to the sea now. I went back and recounted. It's over half a dozen times. And I made my first dive just over a year ago in the Puerto Rico Trench. And that's my dive certificate back there on the back wall, if you could see my thumbnail. Before we go any further, I want to check the room for ringers, because I know some of you are out there. And now it appears that I can't get Zoom up, so it doesn't matter. So I'm going to ask you guys, and Elizabeth, you have to report back to me. First of all, raise your hand, use the reaction button down at the bottom and raise your hand if you have heard of WHOI and you're familiar with what we do. Elizabeth, anybody raise their hands?
There's quite a few. Yeah, there's 1, 2,
okay.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's a few claps, thumbs up. Quite
okay.
a few. Yeah.
All right. One more question. This is. I want you guys to be honest. Now, leave your hand up if you know about Alvin and some of its accomplishments.
Oop, quite a few more.
Still
going up.
Oh, okay. Okay, now, if you've ever dived in Alvin, keep your hand up.
I think there's just one.
Okay. All right. Well, I got one ringer in the audience. You can correct me if I go astray. So for those of you who don't know us, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution is the largest private nonprofit in the world dedicated to the study of the ocean and its importance to humanity and to the entire planet. We have two campuses down at the southernmost tip of Cape Cod. Some of you recognize the first one on the left. That's in the village of Woods Hole, where we have several buildings that are home to part of our biology department, applied ocean physics and engineering, our marine operations, marine policy, as well as our deep water dock, which in this photo you can see has our two large research ships tied up at the time. Neil Armstrong's in the foreground, and Atlantis, which is the support ship for Alvin's, in the background. You can tell that this photo was taken sometime before 2019 or so, because the satellite dome is on the aft end of the ship. It was since moved up to the top, and you might see some photos coming up where that's moved. And then if you're coming down to Woods Hole, about 2 miles outside of the village is our other larger campus, the Quissit campus, and that is where you find a larger assortment of buildings that support like marine chemistry and geochemistry, the rest of the biology department, geology and geophysics, mooring operations, more engineering and tech development, and the administrative offices, including communications, which is just where I sit, and it's just off the page to the bottom. Those of you who've heard of us, and some of you have probably heard more about Alvin, we don't own the sub. The Navy does. In fact, it has an official naval designation of DSV-2. DSV-1 was Trieste, the bathyscaphe that first took humans to Challenger Deep in 1960. And a bathyscaphe is different from a deep sea submersible. It has the personnel sphere hanging from it's basically a deep ocean dirigible, and it is generally less maneuverable than a sub like Alvin. I'm getting ahead of myself, and we're going to talk a little bit about the development of Alvin with regards to Trieste in a moment. But you might have noticed I kind of broke a cardinal rule of science communication. I used a couple of acronyms. The first one, HOV, on the slide up above, that stands for Human Occupied Vehicle. And then DSV in its acronym is Deep Submergence Vehicle. And for our purposes, they're going to be roughly the same thing. So Alvin, if you don't know, is a 3-person research sub. It holds a pilot and 2 observers. It's currently and recently rated to dive as deep as 6,500 meters, which is about 4 miles. And at that depth, the sub can reach roughly 98 or 99% of the global seafloor, even though that's only, about 2/3 of the depth of the maximum depth of the ocean. It's most of the seafloor is within Alvin's reach. And those dives last between 9 to 12 hours, but it does carry enough life support to last much longer in an emergency. The sub, we say that Alvin is almost 60 years old, but in reality, we say the only thing that is 60 years old on the sub is the name. Really, it's the Alvin program that has lasted that long. The sub itself has gone through many upgrades and refurbishments, so that, kind of like the ship of Theseus, if you're aware of the old philosophical question, if you're rebuilding a ship, when does it stop becoming the original ship? It has gone through many upgrades and refurbishments until the sub is completely new. It's a brand new instrument. And especially now that it's completed that major upgrade to extend its depth range from 4,500 meters now to 6,500 meters, it's completely new, completely upgraded. It's made over 5,100 dives. In fact, I'm going to show you an image in a little bit later from dive 5,145. They're back at the East Pacific Rise diving as we speak. But perhaps most importantly, it's taken more than 3,000 people into the ocean to see what's down there firsthand. And that's really important to be able to, and that's what it's best at. But I want to start our time together pulling back a little bit to give you some perspective about why we send people to the deep ocean and why it's so difficult to learn about the ocean in general. It used to be said that and I want to thank Bruce Strickroth, the Alvin, head of the Alvin program, for this initial line of thinking. We used to think that the dark side of the moon was the epitome of something that is distant and remote and unreachable. But in fact, the dark side of the moon is a misnomer. All of the moon's surface gets sunlight at some point. It's just that part of it is always facing away from us. If we really wanted something to hold the standard for the distant, dark, and unknowable, we could probably just turn our attention to our own planet and our own backyard, in fact, out here on Cape Cod. This is a view of the Pacific Ocean, right centered over the equator. I think it's close to the date line, and it's special for the simple fact that aside from a little scrim of land in the upper right that's North America and a little sliver of Australia down in the lower left, there's very little land visible here. So the aerial extent of the ocean, the fact that it covers more than 70% of the planet, makes it very difficult to get out onto, to get to study just across the surface. It's also very deep. If you know the comic XKDC, you might recognize this sort of snarky little take on the depth of the ocean, but it's very, very illustrative of the range that we have to deal with. The surface layer, that light blue line at the top, that's the photic zone. That's as far as light can travel in the ocean. And that's about 1,200 meters, at which there's enough light to conduct photosynthesis. Below that, 200 to 1,000-ish meters, depending on where you are in the ocean, there's still some light, but there's not enough light to conduct photosynthesis. And then below that is the darker parts, the perpetually dark midnight zone, the abyssal region, and then at the very bottom, from 6,000 meters down is the hadal depth. And for the longest time, people thought that really only that very top light blue section was where life existed, that the rest of the ocean was lifeless desert. And it was that belief was held for a long, long time. In fact, it wasn't until the early 1950s that the Galathea expedition proved that there was life below 6,000 meters. So, we're still really in the early stages of exploring and understanding the ocean. And we say that there's a lot we don't know, but in reality, there is still a great deal we do know. But because, as in the scientific community, scientists sort of stand on that precipice and say, and always turn their attention to what they don't know, that's what they play up more and more. But every so often we have to turn around and look back to see how far we've come. There are two things that I would change about this drawing. If you see in the middle, just to the left of abyssal plain, that says Alvin's maximum dive depth. So now that is extended down to 6,500 meters. But the more important little bit of detail that I would add to this is the average depth of the oceans is pretty phenomenal. It's 2.3 miles, 3,700 meters. It means, half of the ocean is shallower than that, but half of it is deeper than that. And getting into that is no easy. It's not easy. Of course, it's perpetually dark. The pressure increases. What is it? An atmosphere every 10 meters, and like I said, it's huge. We say often that we know more about the surface of the moon or the surface of Mars than we know about our own ocean. I want to unpack that just a tiny bit because it's a little bit of an exaggeration. Again, like I said, we know a lot about our ocean, still a lot to learn. But when they say we know more about the surface of the moon and Mars than about our ocean, usually what they really mean is we've mapped more of it. So this is a map from the Seabed 2030 showing the parts of the ocean that have been mapped to high resolution. I'm going to put that in quotes for a reason. You'll see in a moment. Their goal is to map the entirety of Earth's seafloor by 2030 to high resolution. But they have a big challenge ahead of them because right now, to their standards, we haven't even gotten a quarter of it done. And what are those standards? Well, it depends based on depth because they're using acoustics to do that mapping. That's really the only tool we can use to map large swaths of the ocean to high resolution. We have maps that use gravity anomalies, but you can hide whole seamounts in those maps. And in fact, the U.S. Navy has had a couple of mishaps in which submarines ran into seamounts that they didn't know were there because maps just didn't exist. Okay, so the Seabed 2030 wants to map the upper part of the ocean, 0 to 1,500 meters to a 100-meter resolution, and then below that to 200, 400, 800, so on and so on. That might not seem like a big deal, but in reality, it is quite a challenge. And let's compare that to the maps that we do have of the moon. This is the landing site of Apollo 17 landing site. This is a photograph from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter of Apollo 17 landing site. Those dark lines are the footprints of the astronauts as they ventured out from the lunar lander. And this is 1 meter resolution. So we can get this because there's nothing between us and the surface, really. For the ocean, we have a lot of salt water in the way. And salt water presents another problem for us, in addition to the size and the volume of the ocean and the pressure and the temperature and the darkness, because salt water is a conducting fluid. And so it absorbs almost all electromagnetic radiation that passes through it, including light. But that includes wireless, GPS, Bluetooth. Satellites can't see more than a couple of inches below the surface, and then even light gets attenuated in seawater, and especially red, orange, and yellow. And you can see that as Alvin submerges, then all you're left with is the blue that makes the white of the sub turn blue and the red turn black. And at this point, the sub is only probably about 100 feet down, and it's almost gone. But really, as soon as the sail passes underwater, the people inside are on another planet. You can't talk to them except for an acoustic telephone that bounces through the ocean as you speak. So this is the situation that we're talking about studying the ocean. And for the longest time, scientists studied the ocean by sending instruments down, and they learned to get a great deal of information back. But there was a small group of scientists at Woods Hole and other places in the 1950s who saw the growth of Trieste, the Trieste 1 and then later Trieste 2, the deep diving bathyscapes, as something of a model to go down and explore the seafloor. Trieste wasn't what they wanted to do. That wasn't very maneuverable. It did two things well. It could go down and come back up. But especially the geologists wanted something that could take them to explore the seafloor, because geology is a very observational field of study. People, people who, the scientists who collect rocks at very base, at a very crude, this is a very crude explanation, but want to pick up a rock and you don't just collect the rock, you collect it in relation to everything that you see around you. You look at the rock form, the formations that are there. You want to see it in context. And so there is, to a few people, sending your instruments down just by themselves was not enough. And Alan Vine was one of those at Woods Hole. And in particular, he used as his argument that humans have this innate capability not only to be curious and go look for things, but they have the ability to be surprised and to say, huh, that's weird. And I have heard that so many times, just that huh. And when I hear that, when I'm on the ship and we have all these samples come back from Alvin, and people are sorting them and subsampling and examining them. If I hear somebody say that, I immediately walk over because I know something interesting is happening. So Vine had this idea that he and some others wanted to build a 3-person, 2-person research submersible. But a lot of the scientific community was not really, weren't all that supportive. They were fine with, sending instruments down, thank you. But he was able to convince the Navy that this was a worthwhile endeavor. And so this is a vast oversimplification. So for those of you who do know the full story, I apologize. They put out a call for proposals to build a small research sub, and the winning bid was submitted by General Mills. Yes, the people who made Wheaties, or make Wheaties. And that's because the word Mills in their name. I'm going to pause this for a moment. Oops, no, I can't. Okay. They were accustomed to working with large machines and building machines and operating them. So they were contracted to build the personnel sphere that you see there and the rest of the sub. And it was, I think the winning bid was something on the order of $500,000 back in 1962. I don't think they hit that budget. I think it went up a little bit at the very end. But in May of 1964, it arrived in Woods Hole, and in early June, we had a commissioning ceremony to introduce the world to this crazy new sub, and then late June, we put it in the water for the first time. And those of you who know Woods Hole will know that the sub is facing the wrong way. The ocean is to the right. That's because the first dive actually occurred in Eel Pond, which is to the left. And the first dive was to a grand total of 25 feet, 8 meters. But for the longest time, really, the scientific community still did not see the purpose of a sub. And when I went through the dive logs for early dives, it was testing, engineering, training. They were constantly working out new systems. The Navy had new safety regulations as a result of the Thresher accident that occurred just before that, Alvin was put in the water for the first time. So they had to keep meeting new, more stringent safety requirements. And Alvin was really on the verge of being cut when in the early 1970s, uh, the French and the US governments entered into an agreement to do a joint project called Project Famous to study a portion of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, this, if you recognize this map, I think this was a 1978 version of Marie Tharp's seafloor map, is that mountain range that runs down the middle of the Atlantic, the North and South Atlantic, and then up the South Pacific along the coast. It's a 60,000 mile mountain range that completely encircles the globe, almost entirely underwater. It's the source of the vast majority of volcanic activity on the planet. And in the early 1970s, the theory of plate tectonics and seafloor spreading were really brand new. And it was, I don't know how, there were still some people who questioned it. And part of it, I think, is because, like I said, geology is a very observational science. They wanted to see evidence of volcanic activity and of fresh lava flows. You know, they had dredged up rocks from the seafloor, but they lacked that context, that perspective that geology really needs to explain what's going on. And the way to do it would be to send people down. So in 1972, we entered into the agreement with the French to do Project Famous. They did photographic surveys first and laid all these photos out in a big gymnasium down in Washington, D.C. to plan dive locations. You know, but photos are still two-dimensional. You can't get the full idea of context. In 73, I think, and in 74, they did some dives by the French bathyscaphe Archimede. But again, you know, they could go down, look around, and then they had to come back up. They couldn't do the walk in the woods, the field expedition that a geologist would want. And so then in 1974, we put Alvin on the back of our brand new research vessel Nor. You can just see it on the aft deck of the ship that's in the lead there, and put Alvin's tender, Lulu, which was named after, oh, I forgot to tell you guys, Alvin is a contraction of Alan Vine, the person who was the sort of the chief driving force of Alvin, the idea of a research submersible. Lulu was his mother's name. So Lulu is the tender, Alvin is on the back of Nor, and they steamed out to the Mid-Atlantic Rise, and they met the French team with their diving saucer. They had a saucer-like thing, kind of like what Jacques Cousteau eventually had. And Cyan, the French sub, captured this image of Alvin on the seafloor. But they were then able to go down to the seafloor and begin to connect these models of how they thought things were constructed below the surface and how those forces would be represented on the seafloor together, or in some cases not. You know, there was the prevailing theory was they would see a lot of volcanoes on either side of this ridge that runs down the middle of the mountain range of the Mid-Atlantic Rise. But they didn't see that. In fact, they saw evidence of lava flows, like you see on the left, sort of right off of the center of the rise. And they also discovered that the heat that they should see distributed from the center to the flanks of the Mid-Atlantic Rise didn't follow what they expected. There was not as much heat in the middle on the seafloor as they expected to the flanks. And that led them to think, well, there must be some sort of a venting phenomena somewhere that is allowing the heat that they had calculated to exist as a result of radioactive decay of elements deep within the earth So they were able to answer some questions, but like any good scientific endeavor, it raised more questions than it answered. And Project Famous was deemed to be a phenomenal success. The papers that came out revolutionized planetary geology and geophysics. But Alvin was still not completely accepted by broad segments of the community. Before they set out, Maurice Ewing, who was the crusty old granddad of geophysics, he threatened Bob Ballard, who was then at the time a graduate student, that if Project Famous didn't work out, he was going to turn Alvin into paper clips. This is a nice fun fact. As the day before Noor set sail with Alvin and Lulu in tow, Bob Ballard defended his PhD thesis. So if you think that you have a lot to do and you have stress, just remember that. Okay, so Project Famous happened. It turns out to be a phenomenal success, but still not full acceptance. They still have more questions. They go down takes Alvin down to the Mid-Cayman Rise to look at seafloor spreading there, and it's completely different than what they expect. It's a different regime. More questions come up. And they still don't have evidence of what they know must be some sort of way for the excess heat to get out from the crust of the ocean. So they get wind of a couple of expeditions that are happening over in the Pacific, where there should be faster seafloor spreading that a group, I think from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, were dragging some instruments along the bottom and pinging the bottom, and they found evidence of big mounds on the seafloor and of tiny little spikes in temperature, like a 1/10 of a degree change. And so they pack up Alvin once again in 1977, and a couple of other instruments. One of them is a towed camera sled named Angus that was beefed up to the hilt so that it could survive occasional collisions with mountains. And they go to a place about 200 miles from the Galapagos also on the mid-ocean ridge there. And they start towing Angus around. And at one point, they get a sudden tiny spike in temperature. And when they bring Angus back up, this is not digital photography, this is film photography. And they process the film, and on those 7 frames, I think it might have been 13 frames, that correspond to the temperature spike, 6 of which you see here, they see all these clams littering the seafloor. Alvin is back on Lulu at this point, and in the interim, Lulu chugs along, gets to Noor's location where they were towing Angus from, and people on the ship are saying, well, it could have just been a cargo ship that passed by, and this is the remnants of a clam bake that they had for the crew, and so that they call this site Clam Bake. And they started diving there, and almost immediately, John Corliss and I'm going to forget his name now, Van Thiel. I can't remember his first name now. They go down and they are surprised. They see all these clams, and some of which appear to be alive, but they're more focused on the temperature readings that they're getting inside the sub. They're looking, remember, these are all geologists, no biologists on board. They're watching their instruments, trying to figure out where's the heat going, where's it coming from. And I'm going to play you a set of clips of audio from some subsequent dives in that series that I've mashed together into a single clip, and I put some imagery from what they were seeing. And these are the first indications that they have found hydrothermal venting, and that, oh my gosh, they support this incredible diversity of life. And keep in mind, these are geologists describing what they see.
It's 12:24.
Have you ever seen them?
We're at the stopped on the Clambake area, maneuvering to sample some. There are crabs, clams, both alive and dead shells, and some puffy-looking things, which will appear in the photographs. Oh yeah, wow, I can see lots of crabs appearing. Oh yes, that's incredible. We've come to another dandelion patch with lots of worm castings, large crabs. Oh, I can see shimmering water. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. What is that? Yeah, there's water. I think there's shimmering water right over here to the left, coming out right off the top.
12:02:47. We can actually see water shimmering up out of cracks immediately below us, and we're going to try and put the probe in it now. The bottom temperature we have now is 2.145. Very erratic, a range of about a tenth of a degree. It's going up and down. The rocks, now that we're up close to them and stopped, are covered with white worm tubes, just very pervasive all over the bottom. These all over the pillows, these white worm tubes. Some of them actually stalks sticking up vertically from the bottom, from the rock surface. A lot of fractured rocks, stained yellow at the outside, going to grey and white in the interior. A lot of sea anemones and fish.
Oh, I see the organism that lives in these worm tubes. They have they stick out little fans on the end. Big fans, yeah. No, I'm talking about the little tiny white worm tubes, about an inch long, 2 inches long.
The big ones are fantastic. It's like an Indian headdress.
Yeah.
See, that one's sitting on there's like 4 of them in a row right out your court. See, it's oh yeah. I wonder what color they are. You can't tell. They may be red. I mean, you can't tell the color.
So that was really the first time that they began to assemble the pieces of an ecosystem view of these, and at the same time that they're seeing the outflows from hydrothermal vents, they're also beginning to assemble this patchwork ecosystem view of the seafloor. And keep in mind that really at this time they still think that the seafloor of the deep ocean is supposed to be a desert. And they even asked, I think one of them radios up at the sound phone acoustically calls the surface and says, isn't the seafloor supposed to be a desert? And the technician on duty there said, well, yeah. And they said, well, that's not what we're seeing. Now, the reason this is important, everything that we thought or most of what we thought lived on the planet had as its basis photosynthesis, and this is the ability of plants to convert carbon dioxide and water with sunlight into simple sugars and oxygen. And as a result of this reaction, create organic matter that can be eaten by animals, that then those animals become food for other animals, and then you have a food web. And in the ocean, it was largely thought that food, carbon, organic matter that fed animals in the ocean came from the surface. There's algae in the surface waters that can photosynthesize, and then little animals eat that. Zooplankton eats that. Larger animals eat the zooplankton. Larger animals eat that. They poop. They die. They shed skin or shed scales and skin, and that organic matter feeds animals deeper down. And so, as you go down in the ocean, it was thought that there should be less and less food available, which is why they thought that, below a certain depth, there could be almost no life. But instead, what they were seeing was all this complex life in a complex ecosystem. And the geologists, I sort of, use that pejorative to say, oh yeah, they're just a bunch of geologists playing biologists. But if you read the papers that came out afterwards, they were remarkably well tuned to say something's going on here, and it could be that they're making use of the chemicals that are coming out of the seafloor. Originally, it was thought that they were just going to see water going down through fissures and hot water coming out to balance their heat budgets. But instead, what they saw when they brought water samples to the surface in Alvin and opened them up, they just smelled the smell of rotten eggs. So they knew that there was hydrogen sulfide, which meant that this hydrothermal fluid was being the seawater was being chemically altered as a result of the heat deep down below and the rocks that it was in contact with. And this material coming out, in this case, was the stuff that was providing food for the bacteria that were living, in some cases, inside a symbiotic host, like these tube worms over here and these mussels, that were then they were then using the chemicals in the water to create the simple sugars and things that fed the animals that were their hosts, and that then becomes food for other things, and you have another food web being formed. So we had this completely new way of understanding life on Earth, that it wasn't just sunlight that was, beaming down on us and making life possible. There's other ways that life can live and thrive completely separate from the rest of the planet. And this is going to be important towards the end. Afterwards, they also went to other places, and you heard them mention shimmering water. They found, warm water coming out. I think that the highest they registered was something like 17 degrees Celsius, or 60 degrees. They went to a location at 9 degrees 21 north on the East Pacific Rise, north of the Galapagos, close to the same location where folks are diving today. And they found black smokers on the left that were incredibly acidic, that were dumping out very acidic water. And the smoke is minerals precipitating out of the hydrothermal fluid as they hit the cold seawater. They found, this is jumping way ahead, years later, they dove on portions of the Mid-Atlantic Rise back on the other side of the world and found very alkaline systems that were creating these incredibly huge white spires, chalky white spires. So now there's all these different, I showed you one equation for chemosynthesis. There are many, many ways that life has found a way to make, to get a toehold on the planet and to proliferate and to survive quite nicely. Thank you. Okay. I do want to get to questions, but I want to quickly speed through my connection to Alvin, because in 2010, this was 1977, I'm going to jump to 2010. The sub has largely been accepted by most of the research, a large portion of the Oceanographic Research Society research community. There are other ways to explore the ocean. We use remotely operated vehicles where you control it from the vehicle from the surface to move along the seafloor in the water column. We have autonomous underwater vehicles that are pre-programmed and put in the water, and you send them out and they come back at the end of their program, and those are getting smarter. They can be adaptive and do things based on what all of a sudden what they find. So it's almost like they're on the verge of being able to be surprised. But in 2010, I arrived at Woods Hole in May when Deepwater Horizon was happening. And in September of that year, a group of scientists received a National Science Foundation RAPID grant to take Alvin right before it was scheduled to come out of the water to begin its major upgrade, and do a very, very short, like 6-dive series in the Gulf to some deep water coral stands around where the well blowout was. And they wanted to see what did the oil do to those communities, and they established an observatory site to then watch how they recover and how not just the corals themselves, but how the communities, because there are all these organisms that rely on the coral as the basis for a thriving ecosystem. So like I said, very, very short dive series, but that was my first introduction to the complicated process of preparing the sub to dive each day, to put it in the water, to bring it back out of the water at the end of its dive day, and then to watch the scientists mob the front of the sub and get their samples and scurry off into the labs to do their work before the next dive day, the next morning. Alvin was going back into the shop from 2010 to 2014. Three-quarters of the sub was upgraded to be ready for to dive to 6,500 meters. It went back to work in 2014, 14 or 15. I think it was 15, 14, to continue diving, even though it could only go to 4,500 meters still. And then in 2020, just as the pandemic was breaking, it came back to Woods Hole, and the team here did the final set of upgrades, and it was ready to go to 6,500 meters. In the interim, I went on a series of dives with the sub as a communications professional, and I tried to communicate the incredible spectacle of human exploration in the deep ocean. For me, always looking for new camera angles, talking to people, getting their immediate impressions of what they were finding, listening to the chatter between the surface and the sub, see how a dive is going. But it became something of a joke for me. It was maybe not for everybody, but I was always the guy who they said, if we'd had one more dive, we'd have sent you down. And after a while, I said, I don't want to hear that anymore. Just don't tell me if you were considering me to go on a dive. But in 2021, the sub was finished its upgrade, and the Navy still has these very, very strict safety procedures that the sub has to go through to test its stability in the ocean, at the surface and underwater. And then once those were met, we were going to go out and dive deeper and deeper in increments until we got to the sub's new maximum operating depth of 6,500 meters. And I was told at some point in those series of dives, that I was on the dive roster for the next the dive immediately before we went to 6,500 meters. And I said, yeah, I'll believe that when it happens. When the hatch is closing, then I'll believe you. The dive before mine, the sub went in the water, and when it came back and they took the panels off, they found some cracks in the syntactic foam. We paused to figure out what was going wrong. Had conversations with the Navy about whether we could proceed. And at that time I said, I know I'm going to get bumped because they're going to want an engineer in the sub for that. We waited a day, and then eventually word came back. Navy had given us the all clear to go into the water and try again. And again, I was skeptical up until the moment when I walked up the ladder and I got in the sub, and they did indeed close the hatch. And I had seen the sub do its, and all of the people do their dance many, many times. You know, the preparing the sub beginning at 5 in the morning, rolling it out, putting the weights on, rolling it under the A-frame, connecting the lift lines, calling the pilot up to do his final checks, and then calling the observers in, closing, putting it out. I knew all that, and as it was happening, I could tick off in my head everything that was going on behind the scenes to make it all possible. But the thing that I didn't get until we were in the water was Alvin has a personality. When it went in the water and we were getting buffeted by the waves, but as soon as they blew the ballast tanks and we went below the surface, it was as though it just sort of, this thing weighs 45,000 pounds. It was as though it was free of that bulk and it became a ballet dancer. It was the thing that Alan Vine envisioned, that the thing that would allow scientists to go down and make careful, specific observations and collections and measurements that a good scientist needs to be able to do. But it's still a complex and expensive endeavor. So, why do we do this? Why do we keep, just make the effort to go 2,000 meters deeper? Well, we're a curious species, curious and odd, but curious because we're always looking over the next hill, over the horizon, and asking what's there. And in this case, we're looking into the deep ocean to better understand this planet. And I want to pause here just to point out this image on the right. This is brand new. This is folks diving at 9 degrees 50 minutes north on the East Pacific Rise just on Thursday. This is a place they've been to many, many times, but they expect it to erupt at some point. And when it does, it will wipe out a lot of the life there. But they know that the life can come back. How does it do that? How long does it take? These are all questions that still have not been answered, and because we haven't had the place to tell us what happens. And really, if we don't understand the planet, we can't really do what we need to do to give it the protection that it deserves. But also, going to these great depths and exploring and realizing that whole ecosystems are able to be supported by chemosynthetic processes allows us to ask the question that has probably hounded humanity since we were first able to look up at the stars and wonder what's out there. And that is, are we alone? And is this all there is in the universe? And in particular, or in the sort of tongue-in-cheek way, is life a glitch or a feature of the universe? And this we can come very, very close to answering now, or to addressing. Really, there are all these worlds in the solar system. The moon of Europa around Jupiter, Saturn's moon Enceladus, which is shown here on the left, that we know now have saltwater oceans in contact with a rocky seafloor under a thick crust of ice, so they're completely dark. And that rocky seafloor is probably heated geothermally. And we know that where water can percolate down through the seafloor and be heated geothermally, that it percolates back up and it creates these places where life can take hold. And Enceladus and Europa are far enough away that there's no way there could have been contact between Earth and those places. You know, Mars and Earth have exchanged rocky material many, many times in the past. But these places, they're really far out. And if there's life there, then that's proof, just in our backyard, just in our solar system, that life has arisen independently of Earth. And if there's two instances, Earth and one of these two, or both of them, that life exists just in our solar system, then that means life is a feature of the universe, that it's everywhere we look. So I want to get some questions really quickly. Just a quick thank you to the museum for inviting me, certainly to the Alvin group and the captain and crew of Atlantis for tolerating me and sticking my lens in their faces all the time. To our sponsors, the National Science Foundation, the Office of Naval Research, my many, many shipmates over the years, and of course to Alvin. So I will stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was fascinating. I have to say, I got goosebumps when you were talking about Alvin being like a ballet dancer. It's clearly Alvin knows exactly what its job is once it gets under the water.
It does. It has a personality, like I said. I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary that's out, I think on either Netflix or Amazon Prime, about OPI, the Opportunity Rover. Mm-hmm. Watch it, because people endowed the rovers with personalities, and they became personally invested in them. And the same is true of Alvin. It has a personality. It's a wonderful machine.
It also, when you were talking about the moon of Saturn, it reminded me of that line from Jurassic Park with Jeff Goldblum, where he just says, "Life finds a way." It reminded me of that. Yeah. So. All right, so we've got a few questions, and please feel free, folks, to type your question into the Q&A, or you can type it into the meeting chat. I will be monitoring both. The first question is, what can Alvin do that the ROVs can't?
It can carry a pair of eyes and the 3-pound computer that is our brain down to the ocean, down into the ocean. And, yes, I mean, ROVs are fantastic. They're remarkable things. And maybe some people make too much of this, but for many scientists, context is everything. And being able to look out the porthole at the seafloor and to see rocks in context or animals in context interacting with one another in 3 dimensions and in real time is, for many people, it's a game changer.
Imagine. Major game changer.
Mm-hmm.
All right, our next question is, how has Alvin been enhanced over the past 50 years?
50 years, okay. I'm gonna get this wrong. I think the first sphere, the first personnel sphere, could only go to about 6,000 feet. And they kept kind of extending that range by convincing people that it could go deeper and deeper, and they kept diving. And so the real big changes have been to that personnel sphere and the associated systems to be able to go deeper. The first titanium sphere, which is down on our dock still, could go to 4,500 meters. Then, like I said, we put the new sphere in. That's the old sphere was 2 inches thick titanium. The new sphere is 3-inch thick titanium and 6-foot diameter inside, so I can almost stand up. And then, of course, all of the other systems need to be enhanced structurally so that they can withstand greater pressure in order to go deeper. So those are the big things that changed. And then there have been, improvements in what's called syntactic foam over the years. Most of the white parts that you see of Alvin are foam. They're epoxy, excuse me, blocks of epoxy with tiny micro spheres, glass spheres inside, and they provide the buoyancy so that Alvin doesn't sink like the 40,000 pound chunk of titanium that it is. You have to have a little bit of buoyancy for all that, and then adjust it from there with air and water and mercury and other things. So those are the big changes, I think. And then people, I should say, one of the great things that the Alvin group is very skilled at is incorporating new instruments into the sub. So somebody comes, proposes a dive series, and it's awarded by NSF, but they say, we want to take this new gizmo onto the sub to measure viruses. We want to find out what viruses are doing in the deep ocean. And so they say, just a second, and they go away and they figure out, and they're like, okay, we can make it work. So it's constantly changing. It's constantly being added to and upgraded. It's a phenomenal living vehicle.
The next question we have is, has Alvin looked into issues associated with deep sea mining of manganese nodules?
Manganese nodules. Okay, this is one that always comes up. Not just manganese nodules. There's also thought that extinct vent systems, vent chimneys could be mined, also for rare earth minerals. The big patch of manganese nodules is in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which is in the middle of the Pacific, sort of southeast of Hawaii. And now that it has its new extended dive capability, it can reach the Clarion-Clipperton zone. I think that's at like 5,000 meters. And the big question is, okay, if we scraped all those up, what would it do to the ecosystem that lives below the seafloor in the sediments there? We don't even know really what's there. There have been some decent ROV dives, though we're still learning about that. And the other thing is the extinct vent chimneys. Can those be mined? And if they are mined, what happens to whatever ecosystem might use them? It's mostly microbes, I think, on extinct chimneys. But what would the impacts be on thriving hydrothermal vent systems, with tube-worms and mussels and shrimp? And how far away would they have to be? It's, there's still so many questions swirling around about this that we have to get a handle on before somebody just says, you know what, we're pedal to the metal here. We're going to go mine. So yes, but we need to know more.
I also want to say there's a comment in the chat from your second question at the beginning of this lecture about whether anyone had dove with Alvin before, and there is someone in here. Yes, his name is Bob Dyer. He was on 74 to 78.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned that that's my dive certificate back there.
So a question we have, was RV core stretched to be longer? When was RV core stretched to be longer, and was that to accommodate Alvin?
No, it wasn't. And yeah, you noticed in those photos of Nor, it was the short version. I can't remember. It went through its midlife refit in, I think, the 80s, I want to say. And they cut the ship in half, extended it, and put thing in the middle. No, Nor was never the support ship for Alvin. It was always Lulu, but Lulu was not. It wasn't meant for long transit. It was meant to just move around in a dive site. After Lulu, they built the Atlantis II, which was II because our sailing ship Atlantis was the first Atlantis. And then when that one went away, we just had Atlantis II as the support ship. And then eventually the Navy built the new Atlantis, which is what operates today, and that arrived on the scene in 1997.
Another question from the same person is, does Atlantis use a propulsion system similar to Nor's cycloidal drive?
Yeah, that was, man. Okay, this is a ringer that Bob probably identified himself in there at some point.
Yes.
Yeah, the cycloidal drive was a really wild way of driving a ship that was very, very precise and made Nor very nimble, but it was really loud and vibrated quite a bit. And they got rid of that when the ship was cut in half and extended. And it was these two sets of paddles, basically, that hung down from fore and aft of the ship, and they hung down vertically, and those spun, and they could drive the ship forward or turn it and position it anywhere they wanted to. No, Atlantis uses what's called a Z drive, and that's a shaft to a gearbox that goes goes down and then goes back out to the propellers. And these pods that hang down from the ship, sort of below the vertical shaft, those things can turn. Well, actually, I think the whole thing turns, but they can turn 360 degrees. And then the ship has a bow thruster so that it can keep station and position itself very, very accurately. And that's connected to a satellite communication system that tells it where it is at all times to within, probably a couple of centimeters.
Wow. Okay. And we've got another question. There was a period after the most recent upgrades, and rumor had it that the skin was not holding up under the increased depths. What's the real story?
So that's what I talked about, that the syntactic foam, when the sub came out of the water on the dive before I was scheduled to go down, they found a crack. And then after my dive, they found more cracks. And apparently what it was is the foam was just over constrained, so that as it was compressing, the thing about syntactic foam is it has very good dimensional stability. It's very rigid, even under extreme pressure, but it does shrink a tiny bit. And even that tiny bit, when it's really, really constrained, created stress and stresses within the foam, and it showed some cracking. That happens occasionally. The foam does crack, and there's a well-known and accepted repair method for it. But what they really wanted to do was bring the sub back here to fix the over constraint problem so that it didn't happen again. And so they built in a little bit of give in the framing and the connections of the syntactic foam to the sub's frame.
All right. Has Alvin dove? Sorry.
Sorry. One other thing people always ask me, was I ever afraid? Because I went into the sub knowing that it had a crack in the syntactic foam. Never. The two people who were in the sphere with me are two people who work on the sub themselves, Bruce Strickrott and Nick Osaccia. And if they were in there, then I knew it was safe. And the sub has an impeccable safety record. It's just largely unblemished. It's phenomenal.
Right.
Sorry,
those are the two best people to be with when you're going down. That makes
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I would feel very comfortable with them. Has Alvin dove all over the world, and can it dive in Arctic and Antarctic waters?
I don't think there was talk of trying to do a dive in the Arctic, but really it would need an icebreaker escort. There's probably going to be some dives as far north as Alaska in coming years. That's all subject to funding and scheduling. I don't know how far south it's dived. I don't know that it's ever been into the Southern Ocean. But really, ice-covered waters are a different realm. We have vehicles that can go remotely operated vehicles that can go long distances away from the ship. And what that allows you to do is to park an icebreaker into an ice flow, put the ROV in the water, and then just let the ship drift, and the ROV can just stay where it needs to be or go where it needs to go. So that's how we get around that.
Another question. I'm going to combine these two. How long does it take Alvin to dive down to 6,500 meters? And is there a lot of creaking and groaning as you dive?
Not a ton of creaking and groaning. There's a lot of other sounds going on. The acoustics, you can hear some of the acoustics. You can hear the thrusters, a lot of sort of transient noises like that. The time to depth, 6,500 meters, I want to say it was something on the order of 2.5, 2.75 hours down.
Oh.
Somebody can do the math. It's like 40 meters a minute down.
Interesting. Okay. It's fascinating that it's would you call it quiet when you're going down, or?
It can be. There's still a lot of stuff going on. There's still a lot of stuff happening. They're checking out systems. Yeah. The really neat thing is on the way down, you shut off all the lights and you look outside. And I wasn't diving in a particularly productive part of the ocean, but there was a lot of stuff going by. You can see the bioluminescence floating by, and out as far as you can see into the darkness, there's constantly stuff going by the porthole. And they didn't do this for us, but I have heard in the past what they'll do is they'll flash the sub's lights and the bioluminescence will respond. It's sort of what they call ringing. The ocean will ring back to you. That's
so cool. That would be something really, really neat to see. Ugh.
I know. Yeah, I wish.
All right. And the last question for you is one of the earliest dives a swordfish attached
yeah.
the sphere and got caught on one of the titanium plates? Okay.
Yeah, no, it didn't get caught in the titanium. It got caught in the seam between two of the syntactic foam blocks. And they brought it to the surface, and of course it didn't survive, so they had swordfish for dinner. But there's an interesting history between swordfish and Alvin. So there was that where it got attacked, let's say. But I heard about a dive a couple of years ago off here in the Atlantic, where Eric Cordes from Temple was doing some dives on deep water coral stands, Lophelia coral stands. And they were looking out the porthole, and coral was falling down on top of them from above, and it wasn't like a mountainous sort of seascape, but they kept seeing stuff falling from above. And then all of a sudden they saw a swordfish swim by, and it picked up some coral. And so it was, I don't know, maybe a territorial thing, but it was saying, off my turf, buddy. And the whole territorial thing, they have video of vent crabs all of a sudden going up into a fighting pose when the sub comes up, and these crabs are that big, and there's this 45,000-pound sub, and they don't care. They're you're on my turf now, buddy.
Oh, that's hilarious. That would also be something really, really awesome to see. Not gonna lie.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ken. Thank you so much for making it today and for your time and for your expertise. It was such a wonderful presentation and so incredibly informative. I am absolutely fascinated. I'm going to go look up those videos of the crabs,
Oh, yeah. I wanted to just quickly, for those of you who want to know more, you can jump over to, come on. There we go. Our newsletter, we put out a weekly newsletter, whoi.edu/sign up to get more information from us about what's going on. And, there's always something about Alvin happening somewhere in the world. Or if you just want to learn about Alvin specifically, NDSF, that's the National Deep Submergence Facility, ndsf.whoi.edu/Alvin. And you can geek out with me to your heart's content.
Fantastic. And for our folks at the Maritime Museum, our next lecture will be Sunday, February 5th, and that will be all about duck decoys. It's going to be with Paul Phillips. So if you've ever wanted to know anything about duck decoys and the carving of them and what a career in that would look like, it should be a really interesting lecture. Vastly different from Alvin, but still a really, really cool topic. So I hope I will see everyone there. And
I can say that I have been in Alvin and I have been to the Duck Decoy Museum in Maryland. So
fabulous.
they are connected.
They're connected by the water, which is the greatest thing.
There you go. All right.
Again, thank you so much, Ken, and thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
Bye, everyone.